Welcome to Sleep Better Podcast, where every story is written specifically to help you sleep better. For more information about our podcast and natural sleep products, please visit our website, deepbearsleep.com. We've also added specifically selected sleep music after the story ends. If all goes well, you will not hear the end of the story because you will be in a deep and restful sleep by then. Now, let's take a deep breath, relax your body, and let's begin.
The moon hung low, a swollen silver eye watching over the darkened forest as the cool night air stirred with whispers of ancient secrets. The wind sighed through the trees, caressing the leaves and causing them to tremble, as though even they were privy to the primal tension woven into the fabric of the night. In the distance, a castle loomed against the horizon, its jagged spires rising like claws out of the dense, fog-laden woods. The shadows of its stone walls stretched long and crooked over the landscape, casting an ominous veil across the land below. Here, in this forgotten realm where creatures of legend stirred restlessly, two worlds teetered on the brink of collision. Vampires and werewolves, bound by blood, separated by an enmity older than memory. Inside the heart of the forest, a woman moved through the undergrowth with an unhurried grace. Lilith's skin gleamed like alabaster under the moonlight, her eyes a dark, gleaming hunger that reflected centuries of immortality. Her raven-black hair cascaded down her back, her movements fluid and silent. She was a vampire, one of the ancients, and her kind ruled the shadows with a cold elegance that no mortal could comprehend. The night was hers, and it sang to her in a language only she understood. But tonight, something more primal than the night's song pulled at her. There was a scent in the air, earthy and raw, stirring a lust deeper than the hunger for blood. It was a scent she had not encountered in centuries. Wolf. Her sharp senses flared as her pale lips curved into a small, knowing smile. The wolves had always intrigued her, their savage nature a tantalizing contrast to her own carefully measured control. And this particular scent, it was potent, intoxicating, drawing her in like a siren's call. She didn't have to wait long before the presence made itself known. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and powerful. His eyes, golden and fierce, locked onto her with an intensity that sent a thrill through her cold veins. His skin glowed with the warmth of life, and every inch of his body exuded raw strength, held in check by a force of will as feral as it was disciplined. He was a wolf, through and through, yet something about him felt different, more primal. His name was Caleb, and he was no ordinary werewolf. The tension between them was palpable, as if the very air crackled with the clash of their opposing natures. Lilith's predatory instincts sharpened, but Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as though daring her to act on the hunger he knew burned behind her dark gaze.
So it's true,
Caleb rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that seemed to vibrate through the stillness of the night.
The queen of the vampires walks the forest alone.
And the alpha of the wolves dares to follow,
Lilith replied, her voice smooth as silk, her eyes never leaving his.
You must have a death wish.
Caleb's lips twitched into a grin, revealing the faint glint of his sharp canines.
Perhaps. Or maybe I just like the thrill of danger.
Lilith's smile widened, her fangs glinting under the moonlight.
Be careful, wolf. You might find the danger too much to handle.
He took another step toward her, his golden eyes glowing with a hunger that matched her own, though it was not the hunger for blood that lit the fire between them. It was something deeper, something forbidden. Vampires and werewolves were sworn enemies, their histories steeped in bloodshed and betrayal. Yet here, in the darkened forest, the pull of ancient instincts proved stronger than centuries of hatred. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, as their gazes locked in a silent battle of wills. Neither moved, though the space between them seemed to crackle with a tension that could snap at any moment. Lilith could feel the heat radiating from Caleb's body, and it sent a strange, thrilling sensation through her, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Without warning, Caleb closed the distance between them, his hand catching her wrist with a strength that was both forceful and restrained. Lilith felt the heat of his skin against her cold flesh, and the sensation sent a shiver up her spine. She could easily tear herself free, could strike him down where he stood. But she didn't. Instead, she let him pull her closer.
You don't seem afraid.
She murmured, her voice a low, seductive whisper. She could feel his breath against her skin, hot and wild, filled with the untamed energy of the night.
Maybe I should be.
Caleb replied, his golden eyes gleaming with something that looked far too much like desire.
But fear isn't what I feel when I look at you.
Lilith's gaze darkened, her pulse quickening in a way that was foreign, unnatural to her. Her kind were not meant to feel such things, not the warmth, not the desire that now coursed through her veins. And yet, here it was, undeniable.
And what do you feel?
She asked, her voice soft, but edged with a challenge. Caleb's grip on her wrist tightened ever so slightly, his other hand coming to rest on her hip, pulling her body flush against his.
The same thing you feel?
He whispered, his breath hot against her ear. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The moonlight bathed them in a cold glow, the night around them thick with silence. And then, in one swift motion, Caleb's lips were on hers, rough, insistent, filled with the same raw hunger that had simmered between them since the moment they locked eyes. Lilith responded with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his hair as she kissed him back, her fangs grazing his lips as their bodies pressed together. The kiss was like fire and ice, a clash of heat and cold that ignited something deep within them both. His hands roamed over her body, exploring every inch of her as though committing it to memory, while she let herself be swept away by the intensity of his touch. For so long, she had been the predator, the one in control. But with Caleb, it was different. There was no control here, only passion, only need. Time seemed to blur as their bodies moved together, the heat between them building with every stolen kiss, every heated caress. Caleb's touch was rough, primal, and yet it ignited something within Lilith that she had long since thought dead. She could feel the beast within him, the wild, untamed force that lurked beneath his human form, and it thrilled her in a way she had never expected. As they broke apart, their breathing heavy, Lilith looked up into Caleb's golden eyes, now glowing with a fierce, animalistic light.
This can't happen.
She whispered, though her voice lacked conviction.
Maybe not.
Caleb agreed, his voice low, his breath still hot against her skin.
But it already has.
Lilith closed her eyes, the truth of his words sinking in. They were natural enemies, bound by laws and traditions older than either of them. But none of that mattered in this moment. Not under the light of the full moon, not in the midst of the darkened woods where only the night bore witness to their transgression. For now, they were not vampire and werewolf, not predator and prey. They were simply two souls, drawn together by forces they could not control nor fully understand. Forces that went beyond the blood feud that had defined their lives for centuries. Forces that whispered of something deeper, something darker, something far more dangerous than either of them had ever known. In the quiet of the night, Lilith and Caleb stood locked in each other's arms, the tension between them transformed into something new, something forbidden and irresistible. As the moon dipped lower in the sky and the night began to fade into dawn, they knew that this night, this moment, would change everything. And in the heart of the ancient forest, where the secrets of the night still lingered, the echoes of their shared desire would remain long after the dawn broke, an unspoken promise that this was far from the end. As dawn crept closer, a faint sliver of light touched the edge of the sky, though it did little to penetrate the dense canopy of the ancient forest. Lilith and Caleb stood in the stillness, their bodies just beginning to cool after the fevered heat of their forbidden encounter. Yet even as the cold of the early morning began to settle over them, the connection they had forged remained, heavy and undeniable. Lilith slowly pulled back from Caleb, her eyes searching his, the echo of their shared passion still reflected in the depths of his golden gaze. She could feel her body's resistance to the coming daylight, the inevitable pull back to the shadows where her kind belonged. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. This couldn't continue. Her mind knew it. Her kind's traditions demanded it. But her body hummed with the unshakable truth of what had transpired between them. Caleb's fingers brushed a lock of her raven-black hair from her face, his touch gentle despite the raw strength she had felt in his embrace. His eyes softened, the primal hunger of the wolf momentarily replaced by something deeper, more human. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled only with the faint rustling of the leaves, the call of distant night creatures, and the rhythmic, steady thrum of Caleb's heartbeat, a sound that Lilith had found strangely soothing amidst the chaos of her thoughts.
You're thinking of leaving,
Caleb said quietly, his voice laced with an understanding that only deepened the pull she felt toward him.
aren't you?
Lilith let out a soft breath, her eyes drifting toward the shadows of the trees that beckoned her to return to her own world.
I don't belong in the light.
She replied, her voice barely above a whisper.
Not with you.
The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. She had always been a creature of the night, forever destined to walk in the darkness. The warmth of his touch, the heat that had surged between them, it wasn't meant for her. And yet, it had been so intoxicating, so irresistible. She could feel the night slipping away, could sense the sun's slow ascent, and it felt like her time with him was ending far too soon.
I won't ask you to stay,
Caleb said softly, though there was an edge of sorrow in his voice.
I know what you are, Lilith. I know what this means.
She met his gaze, her dark eyes searching for any sign of weakness, any moment of regret that might give her reason to pull away completely. But all she found was resolve, tempered by the same heat that still lingered between them.
You should hate me,
she whispered, her voice filled with an almost bitter amusement.
We should hate each other. It's what we've been taught for centuries.
Caleb smiled, but there was no humor in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of the truth.
Maybe we should. But what's the point of centuries of hate when it only blinds us to what's right in front of us?
He stepped closer to her again, his presence a constant, undeniable force, like the steady pull of gravity.
We've spent so long fighting each other that we've forgotten why we ever started.
Lilith wanted to argue, wanted to remind him of the bloodshed, the ancient wars, the countless lives lost between their kind. But standing here, bathed in the moon's last light, none of it seemed to matter. Not when he was so close, not when his touch still lingered on her skin.
I don't belong with you,
she said again, but the words were weaker now, less certain. Caleb's gaze darkened with something more than desire. It was a promise, a conviction that she could feel as much as see.
And yet here you are. Tell me you don't feel it, Lilith.
Her chest tightened at his words. She did feel it, every pulse of his blood, every beat of his heart. It was wrong, unnatural. It was the pull of something primal, something that went beyond the boundaries of their very natures. But it was also undeniable. And that frightened her more than anything.
I've lived for centuries without this,
she murmured, her voice betraying a flicker of vulnerability she hadn't intended to show.
without feeling like this.
Caleb's hand cupped her face, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her cheek.
So have I,
he said softly.
but maybe that's the point. Maybe we've spent too long living in the past, clinging to rules that no longer serve us.
Lilith's gaze flickered to the horizon, where the first hints of sunlight began to tinge the sky a pale gold. The moment was slipping away, and she could feel the familiar pull of the night receding, urging her to retreat to the safety of the dark. Yet even as her body ached for the shadows, something inside her resisted.
I can't stay.
She said, though her heart betrayed her with every word.
This, whatever this is, it can't last. You know that.
Caleb's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. Their worlds were too different, too at odds. There was no future for them, not as long as their kinds remained locked in their ancient hatred. But that didn't change what had already passed between them, and it didn't stop the pull that still thrummed between their bodies.
I won't ask you to stay.
Caleb repeated quietly, stepping back slightly, though the loss of his touch sent a cold wave through Lilith's body.
But I won't pretend this isn't real either.
Lilith's breath hitched at his words, and for a moment, she considered giving in. She could feel it. The pull, the hunger, the need to let this night stretch on forever. But the sun was rising, and with it came the weight of reality.
I'll come back.
She whispered before she could stop herself. The words escaped her lips like a promise she hadn't meant to make. But once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. Caleb's eyes lit with something close to hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge that nothing was guaranteed.
You'll come back?
He asked, his voice soft but laced with a quiet intensity. Lilith nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light of the moon.
I will,
she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her insides.
but I can't promise when.
Caleb smiled then, a small, almost resigned smile, but there was warmth in it too.
That's enough.
Without another word, Lilith stepped back into the shadows, her form dissolving into the night like a wisp of smoke. Caleb watched her disappear, his heart heavy with the weight of her departure, but also filled with something new. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The forest was quiet again, the wind soft against the trees, the creatures of the night returning to their dens. The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, casting a soft glow over the land. And yet, even as the day broke, Caleb felt the lingering presence of the night in his blood. He would wait. He would wait as long as it took, because in that moment, with the memory of Lilith's touch still fresh on his skin, he knew that some bonds were worth defying the ancient rules. Some bonds, no matter how forbidden, were unbreakable. And as the sun rose, Caleb stood alone in the clearing, the promise of her return lingering in the cool morning air.